Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Ready or Not. I played it on the Xbox Series X. It's also available on the Series S, PS5, and PC. So let's start with the story. There really isn't one. Each of the missions that you go on has their own little backstory, essentially, but it's not like a real story. There's not an overarching story. They're really just kind of stories as to why you're going into each place. One's like a meth house. The other is like a bunch of crazed rednecks out in the woods and just all sorts of crap. Each one has its own little thing, but again, not like a story. So let's move on to the audio, and the music there's music, but yeah, that's about it. And then there's some voiceover work. It's nothing like, oh my god, this is so amazing. It's generally some comms chatter, maybe the enemies yelling at you, some civilians being butthurt that you're cuffing them. In my case, often getting bitched at by the command because I don't necessarily have the right mindset for a game like this. And then there's the sound effects, and that's kind of the peak element from the audio of this game. The different weapons, the different areas, just all of that. The sound effect is really well done, especially on the weapons. Your guns will all sound very different. They'll sound different when they're suppressed, much louder than you'd expect, because really suppressed weapons sound much louder than movies in most games. But whether you're suppressed or not, you get that audio and it's really good. And then the ambient audio, the enemy audio, that actually is really important, because it can help give you a heads up as to where they are. Or some of that ambient audio can actually be distracting, which puts you in danger, and that's kind of cool. But let's move on to the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a tactical FPS. This is definitely a throwback to ye oldie Rainbow Six games when you had to be slow, you had to be methodical, or else you could get wrecked very easily. If you were trying to just run and gun like a madman, you are gonna get smoked. If you don't rely on your team and you don't give them commands and don't have them clearing rooms, don't have them opening doors, flashbangs, all of that crap, if you don't use your team, you're probably gonna get wrecked. And as I kind of alluded to, you are a SWAT team, you are meant to be a life-saving organization, you are law enforcement, you are not a soldier. And that was one of my problems, is I kind of went into this with like more of that mentality where I'm like, hey, I'm yelling my commands, why aren't you getting down? And I just smoke a dude, and then next thing I know, I'm getting bitched at for it. Although there were rarely any real consequences for doing that to a bad guy, but you'd get bitched at a bit. You were really supposed to try and arrest them instead, unless of course they shoot at you. Which, speaking of, if they shoot at you, you get injured and you can patch yourself, but there's a limit to how much you can patch yourself before you just drop dead. You may think you're fine, and then next thing you know, you're very much not. And going along with that, your team, your squad, there is permadeath there, and you have to kind of manage your squad. You can hire new members, but if one of your squad mates dies on a mission and everybody else survives, they're gonna have trauma issues and they're not gonna perform well, so you gotta send them to therapy. So you gotta have kind of a backup team. So you've gotta manage that, which I thought was actually really an interesting element. Other interesting elements were like the weapons and your existence in the world and how it actually impacts things. And when I mean weapons, customization, I think that's really cool. Your gear customization, you can tweak all that. But what I thought was even cooler, since I mentioned weapons, is your weapon exists in the world. Like, if you're in a position where it's up against a wall and you wouldn't be able to shoot, well, you're not gonna be able to shoot. Your guy's gonna bring his gun back and up instead of just kind of shoving it and clipping it through a wall or a door or something like that. I thought that was actually a really awesome element. As for the tactical element, there are a lot of commands you can give, and you can give multi-stage commands. You can split up your team and give the two smaller teams different commands. It actually gets to be a lot, and it can be a bit tough to do on the controller. But I am gonna say, I think the variety of the missions and the areas they give you, I thought that was really cool. I think they did a good job mixing things up with that. And also, one of the best things, the thing that really makes this game much more diverse and gives you a reason to replay, is you're scored at the end of each level, but going into a mission, it will play out differently. The very first mission in the game, I went in and the game crashed on me, and that sucked. I went in a second time and everybody was in a different place, and then I got smoked. And then I tried it a third time, and that time everybody gave up. Nobody tried to kill us. We got them all to surrender and arrest them, which is very different from the second playthrough where they were super hostile and they just opened fire and they killed me the second they got the chance. So I think that's actually an awesome element. And there were several other missions where I replayed them, either because I failed or I wasn't happy with my outcome or score, and they played out differently each time, and that was really fun. Now let's get on to the controls. And I think the controls are well mapped out and I think they work well. As I said, giving commands, it's multi-stage and it works, but like I said, I think controller may not be the best thing. It works well enough. Aiming, moving, responsiveness of the controller, all of that is good. But for doing some of the more tactical things, there's just not as much depth in a controller as there is on a mouse and keyboard, or at least the ease of that depth. Now let's get into the graphics and visuals, and the first thing I'm going to address is I've heard some controversy about this. I never played on the PC, I didn't play in early access, but from what I've heard, the PC version or the early access version had a lot more violence, a lot more extreme violence, as well as nudity and things like that. And that is not present here, so I can only judge based on what I experienced. And since what I experienced, I thought it was graphic enough. You shoot dudes, there's plenty of blood. There's plenty of blood. If you get shot, you can make bloody footprints. Like, there is a certain amount of gore. It's not necessarily the most visceral gore I've ever seen. It's not, you know, chunks of heads being blown away and arms and whatnot. But I do think that they captured a certain visceral realism to the violence of what you're doing. And overall, I think it's a pretty good looking game. I don't think it's necessarily the best. Some of the enemy characters, they look kind of cheesy and generic and not necessarily the greatest amount of graphical fidelity and detail in them. But I will say it's a good looking game and I do think they look good enough. I do think some of the animations probably could be stronger. I think some of the movement could be a little more natural and flow better. And that is for your team, not just the enemies and their movement. But I think the graphics are more than good enough to bring each of the missions to life. The areas, whether it's the post office, a creepy meth house, which that one is the only one that had an unintentional jump scare because I couldn't find the last freaking bad guy, convict, whatever. And then they came freaking out of nowhere with a knife and tried to shank me. And man, startled shots. Startled shots. But yeah, I can't say that this is graphically the best thing I've ever seen. I think the design is good, and I think what they're trying to do looks good. And I think everything they do looks good enough to bring it to life. And really, I think the environments look far better than some of the people do. I think that's one area where the game does shine quite nicely, as well as weapons and gear. I think all of that, there's clearly a lot of detail and effort put into that. And when you're in the menu and looking at your character, there's a lot more detail there. It's really movement that I think could look better for your team, and then like the enemies and the NPCs in the world could look better. One cool thing I thought that they did was as you progress through the missions, you basically open up more areas of the police station. Not that there's necessarily a ton you can do in all of those areas, but I think it's a cool element. Far less cool element was I had a few graphical issues and just kind of glitchy issues in general. In one of the rooms in the police station, a dude's like half of his head is invisible. Like you can see where it's meant to be, but you can't see the whole thing, which is kind of weird. And then on one mission, I had a dude who I was just going around the house, could not find him. Turns out he was like halfway clipped into the wall and I had to just fire as much as I could and hope to hit him, and I did. But that was janky and a pain in the ass, and it did really slow down that mission. And then as for the last issue, I mentioned the game crashed on me in my very first mission. It crashed on me a few more times, which that was frustrating. I really don't appreciate that when I'm on a mission. Maybe I would have failed the first run, but there were other missions where I knew what I was doing at that point. I was much better, and then it crashed and I lost my progress in that mission. So that can fuck off. So let's get into the wrap up. Overall, I did enjoy the experience. The glitches, obviously not so much. And I gotta say, I didn't mind the price. Maybe if it was a little bit cheaper, I would have been happier, but I still enjoyed the experience. I'm not gonna sit there and say I didn't have fun with what I was doing. Okay, in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, do you like tactical games like that where you have to actually be smart? You have to be careful, and in all reality, one random screw up or random change in the playthrough could kill you? As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.